Over the past decade, biology has quietly shifted from a public health niche to a core national security domain. The tools have changed: cheaper synthesis, AI-enabled design, faster iteration, but so has the geopolitical landscape. Biological events can now disrupt societies, militaries, and economies as quickly as cyber attacks or kinetic strikes. And yet, among all the excitement around CRISPR, protein design, or generative AI, biosecurity remains one of the most overlooked defense topics. Today's guest is one of the rare people who has lived both sides of that shift. Max Breet spent years at Anduril building autonomy programs in Europe, and then made the move upstream into biodefense, where he now works on biosecurity at Ginkgo. In his words, biology is becoming the next defining security challenge, but institutions are far less prepared than they were for autonomy or cyber. A dense, important conversation, and one that sets the stage for where national security is heading next. Let's dive in.
Max, I'm very happy to have you here and to have a conversation on what I think is a truly overlooked topic. So thanks for coming by.
Yeah, absolute pleasure to be here, and I couldn't agree more.
So you are one of the very few talents that actually went from working at a defense company here at Anduril to now working on biodefense here at Ginkgo Bio. What pushed you to make the jump?
Yeah, I mean, look, Anduril is a phenomenal generational company and provided me with a hugely formative experience. I will be forever grateful to the founders that brought me on at a very early stage of their journey to build the EMEA teams. I think for me, making the choice on next steps at the 4 years from Anduril was I didn't have conviction to hop to a competitor to write a very similar chapter to the one I'd just done for Anduril. And I think for me, the biodefense piece is not leaving defense and national security at all. It's simply moving upstream of where I think the next round of challenges is coming for the security defense ecosystem. The same dynamics that transformed autonomy, cheap tools, fast iteration, strategic impact were emerging in biology, but with far less institutional readiness, in spite of the fact we'd all gone through a pandemic in recent memory. So to me, it was clear that many of the defining security questions of the next decade will be biological. It's been phenomenal to learn a new category of risk, but still firmly integral to the defense and national security ecosystem.
No, I think that's great, but you're still a few that actually makes the switch. And and I remember you said on a panel that some people will take you as a prepper. What's the hardest thing about explaining this field to people who don't think of biology as a security domain?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think I said I didn't want people to walk away from the panel thinking I was a prepper that slept with a gas mask under his pillow. Yeah. So I think the hard part of this field is most people, and this is my peer group still in uniform, many of my closest friends, most people instinctively think of biology as healthcare or natural science, not as critical infrastructure. And so once you show how biological events disrupt readiness and logistics and national resilience just as effectively as cyber attacks or kinetic strikes, the mental model shifts pretty quickly. Like I haven't yet met anyone across the landscape that has challenged my logic when presented. But the hard part up front is educating why they need to switch the mental model in terms of how they're thinking about biology.
And what happened in terms of changing tools, geopolitical context, that moved bio from a public health topic to now a defense priority?
Right. So I think there's a few bits here, right? So I think over the past decade, I agree that biology has quietly moved from a specialist scientific field into a genuine national security domain. And I think that's the convergence of three things. I think the tools of bioengineering have become cheaper, more accessible, and AI enabled. I think biological events, whether they're natural or accidental, have proven they can disrupt societies, militaries, and economies simultaneously at strategic scale. And then I think competitors have begun treating biotechnology as instruments of state power. So, the reality is COVID-19 made it clear that biology can have system level effects at extraordinary speed. Since then, NATO and partner nations are recognizing that biosecurity is not a public health niche, it is force protection, it is operational resilience, and it is geopolitical stability in the kind of century of biology.
You mentioned in bio, there's been huge breakthroughs. There's been CRISPR, DNA synthesis, gene design, and there's been massive VC interest went into these categories, but not so much yet into biosecurity. So there's been one company, Autos, which announced a round from Lux and OpenAI a couple of weeks ago that made some noise, but otherwise that's pretty much it. Why do you think biosecurity remains a niche today, at least in terms of company built?
Yeah. And I think the prospect of new entrants to biosecurity and biodefense is a positive thing. I think the reality is that biotechnology investment over recent years has mostly flowed towards therapeutics, right? Because the commercial incentives are very clear. So if you weren't making the drug, you probably weren't succeeding in the, in the capital markets. I think biodefense, by contrast, sits across health, defense, interior, agriculture simultaneously. So the responsibility is fragmented and no single institution owns the mission. I think the kind of central executive offices coordinate, but they rarely manage, and the stakes are farmed out across a government ecosystem. And politically, it's easier to deprioritize preparedness until a crisis forces attention. So the tools have advanced dramatically, but our systems for managing biological risk have not really kept pace.
And what exactly are we talking about here in terms of threats? Weaponizing biology can mean many different things. You can have engineered pathogens, you can have targeted effects, you can have a pandemic like COVID, you can have, genetic enhancements programs of soldiers. Which scenario is actually plausible today that, for instance, you think the government should focus on and take action on?
Yeah. But yeah, certainly it's like an incredibly broad spectrum of potential threat vectors. But I think if we're grounded in realistic risks, less the science fiction, to me, they are optimized or modified versions of known pathogens. How would adversaries make them easier to grow or spread? How would they make them resistant to existing countermeasures? How would they target agriculture and livestock to create economic and food security disruption? I think the highly targeted genetic weapons remain theoretically plausible, but technically difficult, right? Albeit warrant persistent monitoring, full stop. To me, the real concern is incremental optimization of the known biological hazards in the kind of near and now timeframe.
So it's not yet possible to basically build a bioweapon with AI protein design?
Well, I don't think that is a substantive statement that I can make. There are more technically qualified persons to do that. But I absolutely think that AI enablement will lower the bar to entry on that type of research and development, right? So therefore, it would be logical that the bar is lowered for everyone, whether you are a highly qualified, government accredited, well-intended researcher, or you are someone coming at it from a more lone wolf angle or kind of with nefarious intent. I think the barrier to entry at the moment is knowledge in biology is mostly accrued through experimentation, right? So you need wet lab access. And that is still, for the meantime at least, like an expensive investment to make, and access is in some way controlled, albeit not controlled to the same levels across the globe in reality. But to me, if I'm yes, I obviously think long and hard on the threat vector of the bioengineered weapon. But if I'm thinking about what is realistically a threat vector now, I think it's much more realistic to think that it's the optimization or modification of known pathogens than it is to get into the kind of human augmentation or de novo bioweapon space. Again, not to undervalue the persistent monitoring of those BW programs. I'm just thinking about, what's the near-term threats.
And what does it look like then, this enhancements of existing pathogens then?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's a scenario is always best to walk this through. If we look at, say, the port of Rotterdam, which is largest in Europe, I think if I have my facts straight, it's second largest outside of Asia, major tributary for European logistics, like a majority of defense aid to Ukraine comes in through that locality. What seems far more hypothetically realistic is how you might simply deploy a naturally occurring high path influenza to that locality, and all of a sudden logistics and supply chain grinds to a halt, for example, right? Not to say that's going to happen, but I just think there is, before you get into the realms of novel bioengineering, I think there's much simpler, frankly, much harder to counter deployments of naturally occurring things to grind the European machine or like the international machine to a halt.
It's just that when we talk about biothreats here, the subcategory of biothreats that captures the most public attention would be the bioweapons.
For sure.
It's been something we talked about a lot during the Cold War, I think. Do you mind giving a short historical context for bioweapons and explain why the field went from famous to more taboo than for decades?
Yeah, I mean, I think the if there is a taboo associated to bioweapons, it's because of the atrocities that the world saw through the 20th century, right? In and around the World War II history. And I think, thus we have the Biological Weapons Convention, which created a strong international norm. The reality is that taboo has been remarkably durable, but it's also created blind spots. I think if nations assume no one would ever do this, or do this again, they're clearly going to underinvest in detection and preparedness. So my take is the solution isn't to weaken the taboo. That's almost a necessity, is to pair it with credible surveillance and attribution and resilience. But that's like the historical origin point is, early to mid 20th century activities that led to the BDIP.
And I think this taboo today has become, as you said, a strategic vulnerability. People don't like to think about it, let alone talk about it. And meanwhile, I think China has called biotech, a commanding height of national defense. Russia appears to be reactivating parts of its old bio program. What does it look like in practice in this country, this revival of biosecurity, bio becoming a security domain?
Yeah. I mean, so without overstating classified or uncertain claims, I think the open source picture is pretty clear. China has integrated biotechnology into its economic planning, its military modernization, and industrial strategy at national scale. That is categorically true. And the reality is China is probably leading the world on biotechnology from an R&D standpoint, from an industrial manufacturing standpoint. Russia uses disinformation aggressively on bio and has shown interest in legacy elements of its historical Soviet programs in Europe on the kind of eastern flank of NATO, alongside very clear use of illegal chemical weapons in Ukraine and the Ukraine. So, the intent and the the ethical guardrails are very different from the, those kind of competitors' standpoint that it is to the West. I think the point for NATO is not panic. It's recognizing that biology is now a field of strategic competition. The priority is resilience, tempo, and reducing industrial dependencies on competitors. For example, the US pharmaceutical supply chain, in its basic raw ingredients, the vast majority of those come from China. That creates a tremendous dependency in your societal resilience or your ability to respond to biological risk in the construct of another pandemic.
The good news is that the West seems to be starting to catch up, or at least to wake up. And I know in the US, 2 weeks ago, they announced that biotech was one of the 6 strategic priorities alongside defense or hypersonics. Looking at what's happening in China or in Russia, what would it take for the West to catch up? Is it something on the policy side of things? Is it on the supply chain?
Yeah. I think I tend to not frame this as an arms race, right? Okay. I think the goal is resilience and autonomy and tempo. I think that kind of chimes with the macro theme of sovereignty across security defense anyway at the moment. But I think that requires 3 things in biotechnology. I think you need a strong allied bioindustrial base, so we aren't dependent on strategic competitors for critical inputs, as to the example I've just given. I think doctrine and institutions that treat biology as a defense domain is key. And I think NATO is actively working on those new concepts, which will be a major step forward in biological preparedness and response. And then thereafter, a tight operator-innovator ecosystem that can actually turn scientific capability into deployable systems quickly. Because otherwise this just lives in, early stage S&T land and never breaks through to adoption. And I think that's the third piece of the puzzle.
Like the concept of biothreat was a very distant idea. And then, as you said earlier, COVID happened and it felt like a global wake-up call as we now understand how biothreats could put the world to stop. The good thing about COVID is that it also enabled stronger coordination between hospitals, programs, government. Does this coordination infrastructure built during COVID still exist today?
Some elements. I think there's still an index on genomic capacity within governments. There's certain data pipelines are extant and ultimately a shared professional memory of global vulnerability. But a lot of it has been eroded. Funding's declined, real-time systems were scaled back in reality, and attention shifted. I think the challenge now is turning what worked under crisis conditions into durable, institutionalized biosurveillance and biointelligence systems that, rather than the temporary fix, and that's always been the challenge for biosecurity and biodefense, is really one of, if not the only strategic risk that sees investment at point of incident or crisis and never before, which is challenging to sustain those enduring capabilities if you haven't got the budgets, the data sharing arrangements, and the kind of political will driving behind it with some consistency.
And do you see a political will and like NATO moving fast on this and like putting budget on this topic?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think my take is there are tailwinds coming for biodefense in 2026 and beyond. I see and hear a lot more kind of coherence on the topic of biosecurity. NATO has formulated, several strategies related to biotechnology and human enhancement. It has emerging concept and doctrine coming through on biological preparedness and response. The right parts of the NATO organization across NIF and Diana and SHAPE and the headquarters are actively focusing on biotechnology. People have paid attention to the US Department of War down selecting biomanufacturing as one of its 6 critical technologies to move forward with. So I think it's there. You really don't need to convince the scientists and technologists this is an important thing. They're already convinced and have been for some time. You rarely need to convince the policymakers either. I think what's important is how you really start to a better, more fundamental connection to kind of the warfighting element, right? Like, how do you actually start to think about the use cases that are going to deliver enduring kind of effect forward in the biodefense construct, at least?
Okay, so that's good news. But then what does it take, like a realistic path to reach a world where biological threats can be detected and neutralized immediately? I think it's something Valtos, the companies I was talking about earlier, is focusing on. I don't know if you had any stance on that.
Yeah. I think the Valtos mission statement, much like Ginkgo Biosecurities, is the right one. I think if I'm pragmatic from so the time that I've spent in uniform and through the Androl years, I think instant neutralization is unrealistic, but I do think that rapid detection and attribution and countermeasure development is achievable, right? But it requires a global biointelligence grid, federated biothreats radar, flexible vaccine and therapeutic platforms, and a clear multi-agency playbook. The various stakeholders need to know what they're going to do at point of incident crisis, and ideally they have some early warning indication. So all of those things would turn biological risk from an unmanageable shock into something states can respond to with tempo and precision, which is just not what we did during the last pandemic. At the moment, we wouldn't see that much better a response in the next one.
When we talk about detection, we talk about radar here, bioradar. There's a fear that we turn this into a Orwellian scenario. Is there a way to prevent, to reach biosurveillance without turning into population surveillance?
Yeah, right. So I think the point on this one is that it depends how you orientate the biosurveillance. Certainly the way we think about it, and the way responsible stakeholders should, is by design. Most biosurveillance is environmental and aggregate, not individual. So strong governance must hard code data security, purpose limits, transparent oversight into the system. And I think the reason for that is public trust is not a nice to have in this category. It's a strategic enabler. Without it, the systems we rely on for early warning will not endure. And that's both the relationship with the general public, like how you bring them on the journey for biological risk. If you think about the mixed response to vaccination programs through COVID, exactly that reason. And then also you need the trust in place between the various government departments and ultimately public and private stakeholders that are driving the sin crisis.
If we come back just on your side, so you're now working at Ginkgo, so bioengineering company, but like you work within the biosecurity unit. What do you actually do there, and what is the biosecurity unit at Ginkgo?
Yeah, right. So Ginkgo Biosecurity, the specific biosecurity division of Ginkgo Bioworks Incorporated, ultimately use biology, sensing, sequencing, analytics to secure biological environments. That really breaks down into two main things, right? So it's global situational awareness and then on-the-ground detection networks in places like airports and hospitals and critical infrastructure. Most of our partners are government or multilateral organizations. And the goal ultimately is a sovereign capacity that countries then own and operate themselves. So how you actually co-design and deploy biosurveillance systems in locality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you have different products. I was looking at the websites. You have a Ginkgo Horizon, which is like a global intelligence platform. You have a Canopy for detection nodes. What does it take more on the technical side of things to build what you call a bioradar?
Yeah. So I think what we have, so yes, exactly. Ultimately, there's two layers of a single radar system. There's Horizon, which aggregates signals from many sources to spot anomalies and trends globally. There is Canopy, which generates those signals locally through deployed sampling and sequencing. I think what we have learned from several years, kind of, again, co-designing and deploying these biosurveillance programs globally, is that biology is local. What is normal in Rwanda is not normal in Norway, right? And so understanding those baselines is essential. You need the foundation of biosurveillance in place before you can start to build in the kind of multi-layered response mechanisms that governments require. So the real challenges are less technical, not to discredit my technical colleagues in the business. The real challenges are not technical, they're governance and logistics and data sharing and making operators and engineers work side by side. Those are very familiar experiences to me from Anduril and the kind of defense technology sector. So when that happens, countries can stand up real capability very quickly. I think the various COVID task force through the pandemic proved that. You need all of those things in place.
Yes.
To get it right. And again, it all starts with massed federated biosurveillance as the foundation.
Okay, thanks for that. And so, you mentioned, so you've deployed systems across, I think, a dozen countries and globally. Like, are there some countries which are much more forward than some others on this topic?
Yeah, a good question. I think the takeaway from my experiences over 18 months looking after the biosurveillance programs across EMEA is none of them are the same. Right? There's not a rinse and repeat model to this. And that's why it is, punitive, expensive, but mission-oriented work. What is the right kind of calibration and design for a biosurveillance in Ukraine, which is something we have and have done for several years now, is less appropriate to, an airport wastewater surveillance program in the Middle East or, a biosurveillance program in abattoirs in Africa. I think it's interesting insofar as every government stakeholder we engage is not necessarily the same. No governments are exactly the same. And frankly, we work across the full spectrum of government apparatus. So what's appropriate to a defense or national security stakeholder is not one and the same for public health or health security agencies. There are some overlaps and there are increasing areas of convergence. But again, this is really about how you sit down and really thoughtfully think about the co-design and the deployment strategy of these systems to get to from the point of raw biological sample, like how you collect, then extract, then sequence, then analyze these materials as a complete workflow with a secure chain of custody of that material through the whole process. And then how you think about tailoring the analytics in a reporting format appropriate to the government stakeholder in front of you, right? Again, which is slightly different between the public health community through to the national security and defense community.
Okay, so no name and shame here.
Yeah, exactly.
So you talk about governments a lot. Are they the only clients who are buying today? Do you see a commercial market emerging? Does it even make sense to talk about commercial market for biodefense?
There's probably two parts to the answer. I think the reality is upfront, those that are paying for or open to contract for biosecurity now are predominantly government. And I think that's will be true for some time and may always be where this primarily lives. Yes, upfront, most of the work is government in some way, shape, or form. That said, I do think there are viable commercial applications, how corporations or multinational airline groups or hospital networks think about their resilience and their kind of continuity, so that when, not if, but when the next pandemic comes, they're as ready for it, and they're already kind of tuned to the protocols and reporting formats the government will want to see. But the challenge is it's just not there now. It's an expense to the business to invest in those areas outside of a compliance-driven requirement from government, right? So that's the hard piece to reconcile. But it's not because the use case isn't viable.
Okay, nice. And so if tomorrow you're becoming a defense minister, I'm guessing the UK just because of your citizenship, what would you do to really bring biosecurity as a core national security function rather than like a health function?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think, again, I started my career in uniform, so nobody needs to tell me why the munitions and armaments for kind of European rearmament are the priority. I think that's categorically true. The bullets, the beans, the bandages for Ukraine matter more than anything right now. And I think we have to move categorically with more tempo and conviction from a defense construct. But in reality, where I would perhaps challenge the system is that I think defense across the ecosystem of government, defense is uniquely placed to step up and lead on this topic, right? It brings a seniority and an influence within the Whitehall construct, at least. It has a track record historically of driving unilateral capability development. And I think it is integral to the current set of defense and security challenges within Europe, like UK can and should step up to lead within the alliance. And I think biodefense is going to be as important in terms of emerging technology and strategic risk as anything else in that category, AI, quantum space. So to me, I would just challenge the system to really step back and think about how they are tailoring the innovation agenda to biotechnology and how they are thinking about biosecurity or biodefense as the responsible underwriting for faster, more responsible innovation in biotech, because I think it will bring inordinate returns. And actually in this category, more than anything else, it is a whole of government problem, right? So you're going to need better lines of communication between the government departments. And I think, again, that is an area where defense is uniquely placed to show some leadership.
You sound very hopeful. Are you optimistic that we can get ahead of biological risk and get all this discussion and infrastructure together in the next decade or so?
Yeah. I think I bring several decades of scar tissue in terms of engaging government on emerging technology. First as an end user and then in the private sector. I think I am a pessimistic optimist. So cautiously, yes.
Okay.
I think technology is improving just faster than the risk. I think governments are beginning to treat biosecurity as a defense priority, and institutions like NATO are developing the doctrine, which is the first building block. It depends on sustained political will. And so if attention fades, the window narrows. I think if we treat biosecurity as a core national security mission set, we, the UK, the West, Europe, can definitely stay ahead of competitors.
Okay, great. That's a very helpful message. Thanks for that. And actually, lastly, because you personally going for military, then defense, then now biosecurity, are there some like books or podcasts that really help you grow and like become knowledgeable?
In the bio category specifically,
Yeah,
you mean?
yeah.
Yeah,
When
I
you're
mean,
like, okay, this is like the challenge of a decade. Let's go into this industry.
yeah, I mean, look, when I was first moving from the military into the private sector, I had the fortune of Chris Brose being the strategy officer at Anduril and having gone to the trouble to essentially write the playbook in the kill chain
Mm,
that we now kind of consider essential reading for
yes.
anyone thinking about defense. I don't think that yet exists in biosecurity is the reality.
Mhm.
Maybe that's the opportunity for
Maybe you should write it then.
me and the colleagues to get to work. Not to say I have the same talents as Brose, but I think there are increasingly sharp and eloquent analysis coming out of think tanks and academics institutions. I will point to a few bits. I was very fortunate to be a co-author on the Tony Blair Institute biosecurity paper. That was an excellent exercise in sitting down and thinking about the right architecture for governments on biodefense. And then outside of the work I've done, I think Stanford's Hoover Institution has just published a really excellent paper on biosecurity. I think it's called Biosecurity, really. But that's about as good as it gets in reality in terms of a neutral but really broad and technically accurate perspective on biosecurity, I'd say.
Yeah, I saw you shared it, so I read it. I'm going to put the link as well in the notes of this episode. And I saw that Ginkgo has also started a newsletter, another signal on this topic, then to educate the public. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the communications is as important as anything else on this topic. And I think we got to a point where we realized in kind of like closed forum live sessions that people were responding well to the thesis of biosecurity. And so we should probably go to the trouble of documenting our various thoughts on that topic too. So yeah, I mean, I think we'll keep driving that writing. And I think anyone else interested in the field should go and write some, should put pen to paper too on this, because everything helps the education of the broader ecosystem.
But definitely. And then maybe one day you'll write the equivalent of a kill chain book.
Yeah, I think we'd have to certainly change the language, but for sure there needs to be some kind of long form writing on the topic.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Max, for coming by. I think it was a very important conversation to have. So thanks for your time.
Awesome. Real pleasure. Thank you very much.